coins when they were making their own coinage. They would put the palm branch on those coins. And so the Jews in the first century had very much come to see the palm branch as a symbol of national sovereignty and freedom and maybe self-rule, that they would have a king who would be able to free them from the Romans. And so as Jesus comes in to town, riding up the hill toward Jerusalem, and as they are laying these palm branches down, it's not just to pave the way for him and not so that his donkey's feet wouldn't hit the dirt. It's for a very specific reason. They expect him to be king. I mean, all through this, there is meaning in this story, and especially now as they're shouting the word Hosanna, which has by this point in time become a term of praise for a ruler. But the real meaning of Hosanna is this: it's save us. It's save us. And so they're asking Jesus to be the saving king. They just didn't know what kind of saving king he had come really and truly to be. So they're partially right. But they couldn't see what was obvious right in front of them as well, right? So much so that the next thing they do is shout these words: "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the King of Israel." Now this was a big deal. I mean, can you imagine if something like this happened in our day? This would be almost considered the precursor to some kind of revolt. Right? If a whole bunch of people gathered in Washington and we've got a president, right? And whether it happens before the election, after the election, or whether it happened 20 or 30 years ago, 50 years ago, that doesn't matter. That's irrelevant. What would happen is if somebody marched in and everybody was proclaiming that person as president or ruler, do you imagine that the current president might have some questions? Like some problems with this? And certainly as Jesus comes into Jerusalem as King of Israel, you can bet that the ruling class, or declared by the people as King of Israel, the ruling class had a real problem with this. Now we see that perspective. We see what the crowd was thinking. We see what the crowd was doing. But now we see John turn and tell us what Jesus was doing through this. And maybe even to some degree what some of this means. This is what happens next. Jesus found a young donkey, and if you read the synoptics, you can see how this happened. Jesus found a young donkey and sat on it, as it is written, "Do not be afraid, daughter Zion. See, your king is coming." I mean, especially for those who understood Old Testament prophecy or knew the Old Testament, they would have remembered these words, which is a collection of words from several different Old Testament books that John brings all together, seated on a donkey's colt. Now, let me ask you this question. What would you expect a king to ride into the city upon? I mean, honestly. What would you really expect a king to ride into the city on? I mean, yeah, a chariot, a horse, some sort of a stallion, right? A white stallion, a black stallion, some sort of big animal, right? Not this young donkey's colt. Yet this does connect with Old Testament prophecy in particular. Now, certainly, there's something to this, however. I mean, if Jesus had come in riding a war horse, then that would have sent a particular message, right? But if he comes in riding this young, not even broken in donkey, well, that's intended to send a message as well. And John doesn't really get to that specifically, but Matthew sure does. In fact, here's what Matthew says about this in Matthew 21, 4 through 5. This took place, again, Matthew says, to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet. Say to daughter Zion, but this sounds very, very similar to what John just told us, right? Say to daughter Zion, see, your king comes to you, gentle and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. So what does Matthew tell us? What does he tell us about Jesus, Jesus specifically? Your king comes to you, but what's next? Gentle. Or sometimes that's translated humble. Your king comes to you gentle and humble riding on a donkey and on a colt, the foal of a donkey. Though he wasn't riding two animals, it's to say riding on a donkey. Oh, and by the way, it's not just any donkey, it's actually the colt, the foal of a donkey. And so that's how Jesus chose to come into town. Very intentional that way. Now, what John tells us next is very interesting. John says this. He says that first his disciples did not understand all this. The way that this is written in the Greek is to indicate that it wasn't that they didn't understand everything. They understood some things. That's not the way the Greek reads. The way the Greek reads is they didn't understand all of it. I mean, all of it, every bit of it. They didn't get it. Even his disciples, the closest inner circle, didn't understand what was happening in this moment. They were right there with the crowd and probably thinking to themselves as they're walking, especially the 12, right? They're walking next to the king. I mean, certainly we see this with his disciples. Hey, could you give us that spot on the left and the right of you? Mom, could you go ask him if we can have the spot on the left and the right of him? And then the rest of the disciples being mad because they wish they'd have beat them to it. Right? I mean, they were thinking power in this moment. This is what's going to happen. And Jesus is going to liberate us from Rome. This is going to be like the Maccabees again, but maybe better. So John says they did not understand all of this. In fact, what we see next is this, that only after Jesus was glorified did they realize that these things had been written about him. Right? Only then did they realize that these things had been written about him. Only after he'd been glorified. Well, what is this idea? I mean, this is Jesus. Jesus goes and he gives his life on the cross. He's raised on the third day. He ascends into heaven. And there's even this moment right before he ascends into heaven where his disciples say to him this, Jesus, is now the moment that you're going to restore the kingdom to Israel? And Jesus is looking at these guys saying, after all this, you still don't understand. That's not what I came to do. And the next part is kind of interesting. And that these things had been done to him. In other words, Jesus wasn't the one who orchestrated all the palm branches. Jesus wasn't the one who came in and wanted to be necessarily proclaimed as King of Israel in this way. This is what had been done in a sense to him. The people were doing something. While Jesus was doing exactly what he intended to do, the people were doing something too. And they were missing what Jesus had really come to do. Bottom line is this. The crowds did not understand what Jesus was doing and what he had come to do. The crowds didn't get it, but his inner circle didn't understand what Jesus was doing and what he had come to do. In so many ways, as we read the Gospels, we might walk away feeling like they ignored the obvious. I mean, there was a time in John, I think it's John 6, when Jesus feeds the crowds, and what does the crowd do in that moment? I mean, Jesus performed this incredible miracle, and the crowds grab him, and in that moment, they try to make him king. And Jesus says no. I mean, we could say they ignored the obvious because they were with him and learned from him, and they saw those moments, they ignored the obvious. Or we could also say maybe this way, they couldn't see the forest for the trees. They were missing what was right in front of them. But there were so many things that had happened that maybe got them caught up in what was happening around them. I mean, like this, right? Now the crowd that was with him when he had called Lazarus from the tomb and raised him from the dead continued to spread the word. Well, where had Jesus just been earlier in this chapter? At the very place where Lazarus had been raised from the dead in Bethany. And so as Jesus comes back through Bethany, man, those crowds are waiting for the next thing. What's he going to do next? Well, he was going to do something next, but what were they looking for? And many people, because they had heard that he performed this sign, went out to meet him. And they were not the only ones. The crowds and the disciples were not the only ones that were thinking Jesus was about to do something that was going to topple the power structure as it was. We see in verse 19 a group that was in power, in a sense. The Pharisees saying to one another, and they get all the priests, a lot of the priests in on this too. The Pharisees said to one another, "See, this is getting us nowhere. Look, the whole world has gone after him." Certainly, they saw something that they thought was happening as well, as the crowds are doing what they're doing, as disciples are doing what they're doing. The Pharisees now do what they do, but through all of that, Jesus is doing what he knows he's called to do. Now, I think what we know, because we know the rest of the story to some degree, at least the basic plot line, we know this next thing, that Jesus did not come to destroy Rome, but actually what he was going to do, in spite of Jewish opposition in the next several years after Jesus ascends to heaven as the church is formed, we see this in the first several chapters of Acts. As the Gentiles first start to come into the kingdom as well and are now part of the church, but they'd been excluded from God's people for years, we find out that Jesus came not to destroy Rome, but to seek and save the lost of Rome, just as Jesus came to seek and save the lost sheep of Israel. And what the disciples discover is that their agenda, and what the crowds discover, and it takes some time, is that their agenda was not his agenda. But if they'd been listening, as Jesus speaks to Pilate on trial, they would have heard these words. John 18 now. Jesus speaking to Pilate. "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders, but now my kingdom is from another place." His agenda was not their agenda. Now, I think what's very important for us, if we take just a moment of self-reflection, sometimes we have to take a step back and realize that there's the truth in this, that my agenda may not be God's agenda. The agenda of the people that day was not Jesus' agenda. The truth was this: Jesus came to be a king, and Jesus is a king. But Jesus was not the king the crowd or even his closest disciples expected. And here's the good news: he was a much better king than that. I mean, when we think of Jesus, if Jesus, all he had done was come to set up another earthly lineage of kingship, and he reigned for the span of a lifetime, what good would that really have done? Certainly it would have been of no good to you or to me. But Jesus came to be a king that would reign and rule forever. And certainly right now, we don't always see the signs of him reigning and ruling. And so we're living in this in-between time, like the week Jesus is about to walk into is an in-between time. As he is, yes, the king. But one day, everyone will see that he is the king. And there's a day coming when every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that Jesus is Lord, and that Greek word there is meant to indicate king. Kyrio, he's the Lord. He's the king. So Jesus was not the king that the crowds expected, or even his closest disciples expected. He was much, much better than that. The truth was, he's the king they needed. And then much beyond that, he's the king that we all need. And we're going to see that as we walk through this week and as we move into next week in particular, as we celebrate Easter and the resurrection. Yes, Palm Sunday is incredibly significant. The crowds recognized him as king. They just misidentified what kind of king he was coming to be. Jesus did not deny that he was the king. He's just waiting to understand waiting for us to understand, waiting for them to understand what kind of king he really came to be. And as we find out what kind of king he is, a king that will be king forever, a king that can be king of my life and king of your life now, but a king that has all authority in heaven and on earth, and one day all will see it, we find out truly that he is the king that we all need. Now, I want to offer an invitation as we wrap up this morning's message. And here's what I want to say. I reached a place in my life where I realized I'd been living as king of my life, and I wasn't very good at it. I mean, not good at it at all. In fact, so many things that I did ended up in messes, and ended up in broken relationships, and sometimes broken friendships, and sometimes plans that I had laid that ended up all messed up. And I realized I was not just a broken person, I was a broken person trying to be in charge of my life. And I needed someone else to be in charge of my life. I needed to listen to another king instead of trying to continually be king of my own life. And as time has gone on, I found out more and more that Jesus is the king I need. And that first moment of submission and surrender to him, I'll be honest, was a little bit of a struggle. I mean, it was hard for me to say, I'll step down so that he can step up. That was not an easy choice. But let me tell you now, the more I follow Jesus and the more I find out that he's just the king I need, the more surrender and submission to his leadership is not difficult. It becomes a joy. And I realize I don't have to do this on my own. In fact, I was never intended to. Now, there may be someone in here this morning. Maybe you're here this morning and you've been trying to sit on the throne of your life for your whole life. However long you've lived. You know that's true about you. And here's the truth. It may be that you are someone who's been following Jesus to some degree for your whole life, but you've still been battling him for who's really king. If that's true about you, I can tell you, surrender and submission to him is worth it. There's no better choice you'll ever make. And it may start with a battle and a struggle. But the more you find out that the king that he is the king who battles for you, the less you're going to want to battle against him. He's just the king you need. And so this morning we offer this invitation to respond to Jesus as king and say, whether it's the struggle now or whether it's easy and you want to run to him, you can give your life to him because he's given his life to and for you. We're going to sing a song of invitation. I believe it's Victory in Jesus. As we sing together, he won the victory and helps us live victoriously. If you want to respond to the invitation, you can do so as we have for years by coming forward, or just grab me or grab someone on the way out. And together, we can celebrate the good King, Jesus the Christ. Let's sing together.